Welcome to General Motors 4x4 System Diagnostics presentation for Virtual Training Solutions. In this chapter, we will be taking a look at the diagnostic routines needed to diagnose today's General Motors 4x4 systems. My name is Pete Husher, and I'll be your host for this course. It's a great day to fix transmissions, so let's get started. General Motors 4x4 systems are controlled by the Transfer Case Control Module, Automatic Transfer Case Control Module, or the PCM, depending upon vehicle application. The Transfer Case Control Module, Automatic Transfer Case Control Module, or PCM, uses various inputs and outputs to control the 4x4 system operation after all parameters are met. The Transfer Case Control Module, Automatic Transfer Case Control Module, or the PCM confirms the request for range change has been completed by illuminating the appropriate indicator light located on the dash. Diagnostic codes and data can be retrieved by using the scan tool connected to the DLC connector or by retrieving codes manually on the NV233 transfer case system. The early NV233 systems found on Blazer, S10 trucks, and Tahoe applications will not allow data or code retrieval with the scanner. However, manual code retrieval is available. To retrieve codes manually, locate the data link connector near the right side of the steering column. Install a jumper wire between the DLC terminal number 13 and ground. Turn the ignition switch on and observe the four-wheel drive selector light status. After approximately 3 seconds, if there is a code in the Transfer Case Control Module system, the four-wheel drive indicator lights will start to flash. All NV233 transfer case codes are single-digit codes. These codes are code number 1, Transfer Case Control Module internal failure. Code number 2, encoder circuit failure. Code number 3, motor circuit failure, and code number 4, Transfer Case Control Module RAM-ROM failure. To clear these codes, remove the TL courtesy fuse on T-Series vehicles or the transfer case fuse on K-Series vehicles. Wait 2.5 minutes and then reinstall the fuse. Cycle the ignition switch 5 times and these codes should be cleared from the Transfer Case Control Module. To diagnose code number 1, TCM internal failure, turn the ignition switch on and check for battery voltage on circuit number 1640, which is an orange wire at the Transfer Case Control Module terminals number D14 and D15. If battery voltage is found at Transfer Case Control Module terminals number D14 and D15, check your Transfer Case Control Module ground circuits at terminals number C9, C10, D10, D12, and D13. If Transfer Case Control Module has good powers and ground circuits, replace the Transfer Case Control Module and recheck the 4x4 system operation. For code number 2, encoder motor circuit codes. If this code resets again, disconnect the transfer case harness connector. Turn the ignition switch on and verify that you have a 5-volt reference coming down from the Transfer Case Control Module on the transfer case harness connector number 1, 2, 4, and 8. If the Transfer Case Control Module is delivering this 5-volt signal to the encoder motor circuits, the Transfer Case Control Module has done its job. The next step is to measure the resistance from the encoder motor circuits to the transfer case ground. If the resistance in the circuit is less than 5 ohms, on any other circuits, replace the encoder motor assembly. If the resistance on the internal circuits is greater than 5 ohms, the next step is to check the resistance on circuit number 1554 from the Transfer Case Control Module to the encoder motor. If the resistance is less than 2 ohms, replace the Transfer Case Control Module. Remember, always check the Transfer Case Control Module power and grounds before replacing the Transfer Case Control Module. For code number 3, motor circuit fault. If this code resets again, check the 20 amp 4-wheel drive fuse located in the instrument panel fuse block. If the 4-wheel drive fuse is blown, repair the circuit as needed. If the 4-wheel drive fuse is not blown, turn the ignition switch on and while moving the 4-wheel drive selector switch between 4 high and 4 low positions, measure the voltage at the encoder motor circuit terminals number 6 and 7. The voltage should alternate between positive 12 volts and negative 12 volts while moving the selector switch between these ranges. If the voltage alternates from positive to negative, replace the encoder motor assembly. If the voltage does not alternate from positive to negative, check the motor control circuits going back to the Transfer Case Control Module. If the motor control circuits are good, suspect a faulty Transfer Case Control Module. For code number 4, Transfer Case Control Module RAM or ROM failure, if this code resets again, we need to check the power and grounds at Transfer Case Control Module terminals number C6, C8, D14, and D15. Check the ground circuits at terminals number C10, D10, D12, and D13. If the transfer case control module power and ground circuits are okay, it would be recommended to replace the transfer case control module. This is a list of codes you might encounter while working on the NV236 and 246 transfer case systems. The first code you'll encounter is B2725, which is a select switch circuit fault. You can check the transfer case control switch circuits by first verifying that the transfer case control switch is getting the correct voltage to the switch. The NV236 and 246 system uses an 8-volt reference voltage to its control switch system at terminal number A of the control switch C1 connector. Refer to your 4x4 system wiring schematic for your specific vehicle. If you do not have the correct voltage at the control switch, a circuit check would be recommended. If you have the correct voltage at the switch, the next step is to check the resistance of the transfer case control switch itself. This can be done by checking the resistance across the C1 connector terminals A and B. Resistance should be as noted on your graph. If the transfer case control switch and the circuits are within specifications, General Motors recommends replacing the transfer case control switch anyway. Transfer case control switch problems are very common. For code CO303 and CO305 and CO376, these are speed sensor circuit codes. You can check the speed sensor circuits by back probing into the transfer case control module C1 connector at terminals number E12 and E13 for the front speed sensor and terminals number F5 and F6 for the rear speed sensors to monitor each of the speed sensor signals. The speed sensors should be producing a 3.25 volt AC signal at approximately 5 miles per hour, and this should climb as speed increases. If the signal is correct, you may have an intermittent problem or a faulty transfer case control module. If the speed sensor signal is erratic or there is no signal at the transfer case control module, a circuit test would be recommended. If the circuits check out okay, check the suspected speed sensor resistance. The speed sensor resistance should be between 1300 and 2700 ohms. If the resistance is within specifications or your codes are intermittent, suspect connection problems. For code CO308, CO309, and C310 AB motor circuit faults, you can check the AB motor circuit by back probing into the transfer case control module C2 connector terminals at B and A and performing a continuity test through the motor circuit. The resistance of the AB motor circuit should be between 5 and 35 ohms. If the resistance at the transfer case control module C2 connector is correct, suspect a faulty transfer case control module. If the resistance is not correct, a circuit test between the transfer case control module C2 connector, terminals A and B, to the encoder motor C1 connectors A and B would be recommended. If the circuits check out okay, check the resistance of the motor at the encoder motor C1 connector. Resistance should again be between 5 and 35 ohms. If the resistance is not within specs, replace the encoder motor assembly. For code CO323 and CO324 encoder lock circuit codes, you can check this circuit by first checking for battery voltage at the encoder motor C1 connector terminal number C. The next step is to check the resistance of the encoder lock circuit inside the encoder motor assembly. Perform a continuity check between encoder motor C1 connector terminals C and D. The resistance should be between 20 and 80 ohms. If the resistance is not within specifications, replace the encoder motor assembly. If the lock resistance is within specifications, a circuit test of the lock circuit would be recommended. The lock circuit control test can be performed between the encoder motor C1 connector terminal number D and the transfer case control module C1 connector terminal number E1. If the circuit tests are within specifications, suspect a faulty transfer case control module. Remember, encoder motor connections and internal problems are common. For code CO327 encoder circuit fault, you can check the encoder circuits by performing circuit tests or continuity checks between the transfer case control module connector and the encoder motor connector. The next step is to verify the encoder motor is receiving an 8-volt reference signal at terminal number E of the encoder motor connector. If you have the 8-volt reference signal at terminal number E, the next step is to check the encoder ground circuit from the encoder motor connector A to the transfer case control module C2 connector terminal number F12. If you have good power and grounds and the encoder motors check out to be okay, replace the encoder motor assembly. Encoder motor assembly problems are very common. For CO367 front axle actuator circuit fault, you can check the front axle actuator circuits by first checking the power and ground circuits going to the front axle actuator. On the NV236 systems, check for battery voltage on the front axle actuator connector terminal number C. The next step is to check the ground circuit on terminal number E of the actual actuator connector. Once the power and ground circuits have been verified, the next step is to perform a circuit test on the front axle switch and the front axle control circuits from the transfer case control module C1 connector terminals number E14 and the front axle actuator connector terminal A, and between the transfer case control C1 connector terminal F4 and the front axle actuator connector terminal number B. On the new Venture 236 system, check for battery voltage terminal number A of the four-wheel drive indicator switch and the front axle clutch solenoid. The next step is to perform a circuit test from the B terminal of the four-wheel drive indicator switch connected to the transfer case control module connector, terminal number E14, and from the B terminal of the front axle actuator to the transfer case control module C1 connector, terminal number F4. If the circuits check out okay, suspect an intermittent connection problem or a faulty front axle actuator. General Motors recommends replacing the front axle actuator to correct this concern. For code CO374 and CO387 unable to complete the shift, these codes are usually set because the transfer case control module was unable to perform the shift as requested. This is usually a mechanical problem in the transfer case or an encoder motor problem. Remove the encoder motor and attempt to shift the transfer case manually. If the transfer case can be shifted manually through all ranges, replace the encoder motor assembly. If the transfer case cannot be shifted manually through all ranges, remove, disassemble, and repair the transfer case. For CO550 ECU fault and CO611 VIN error, these codes are set because the transfer case control module suspects an internal failure or the transfer case control module has a VIN recognition problem. Check the power and ground circuits going to the transfer case control module. If code CO550 returns, General Motors recommends replacing the transfer case control module. If code CO611 returns, the VIN must be entered into the transfer case control module for your specific vehicle. If the CO611 returns again, General Motors recommends replacing the transfer case control module and re-entering the vehicle's VIN number. This should take care of that code. Here you will see the connector terminal identification for the NV233 transfer case system. Here you'll see the connector terminal identification for the NV236 and 246 four-wheel drive systems. And this is a continuation of the NV236 and 246 four-wheel drive system connector terminal identification. This is a typical 4x4 system wiring schematic for the NV236 four-wheel drive system. This is the typical 4x4 system wiring schematic for the NV236 and 246 4x4 system. This concludes our chapter on General Motors 4x4 system diagnosis. We want to thank you for participating in our Virtual Training Solutions presentation powered by ATRA. Until next time, let's keep fixing transmissions together.